Thank everybody for joining, and I am joined here with my friend and collaborator Marty Behrens. I met Marty a few years ago within the meetup groups that we organize in Sacramento, California, and we're a part of this thing we're calling the Enlightened Worldview Project. Marty is also working on this local Sense News and ABCs for a New Democracy. And Marty's been around in these integral and liminal metamodernist circles for quite a number of years. So you're kind of an elder in this space.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, it's been a lot of years that I've been, using and playing with the integral framework. And I think in many ways that's what led me to first reach out, Brandon, when you were organizing the different community groups. And I was just struck by your energy of organizing political and philosophical discussions kind of in mainstream communities. And then, of course, once I joined and started participating, I realized that Brandon had been doing this for at the time, like 10 years. And I had to take my hat off and think, that kind of consistency and dedication of bringing in the community to talk about what ostensibly are quite difficult topics, right? Where, especially these days, where you'd almost expect people to be, getting close to fisticuffs, if you will. But it's always gone incredibly well. And the Enlightened World Project and the other community initiatives that we've been involved in, I've always appreciated your steadfastness and your leadership and your vision. So it's really great to be here with you today, and thanks for the invitation.
All right. So thank you for attending this integral sense making for global and national events.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're going to talk about processes and frameworks today, and we're probably going to try to rattle through them a bit, but there will be lots of, hopefully, a fair bit of time at the end to get everybody here who's on this call involved if you want to. We'd love to hear from people, both in terms of feedback and questions. We'd like to make it as interactive as possible, but you'll have to forgive us that there's a fair bit to go through because we're also talking about this difficulty with this information environment that we're embedded in and how difficult it is to make sense of the news and information and how to process that rationally, but also make pro-social decisions in our lives, individually and collectively. So with that, I think I'll turn over to Brandon, and he's going to take us through at least the beginning of what is sense making.
Yeah. And sense making is the process through which people give meaning to their collective experiences. And we should note that there are different meanings of the word meaning. So we could be talking about meaning as significance or understanding or intelligibility, or meaning as purpose. So those are like, okay, that's more of like the existential side of purpose, or what am I doing? Why? In this case, we're actually mostly talking about sense making as intelligibility of the sea of complex information that we're being bombarded with. And so we would use a different term, meaning making, to refer to, the existential purpose. That is interrelated. We'll recognize that, but we're just for the sake of, we're just going to focus mostly on the intelligibility here. And in the mainstream media and social media, we are being constantly bombarded with claims, a large proportion of which are untrue. The media landscape has complexified in recent years, especially with the rise of social media. Much of the information sphere has taken on a post-truth character, and the constant bombardment and sensationalized disinformation has led to an increasingly polarized world and fraying of the socio-cultural fabric. We see this happening within the US, within other Western democratic countries, and at the global scale as well.
Yeah, and the context here, it's interesting. In addition to defining sense making in the way that Brandon has, it's also interesting to put it in the context of how sense making, decision making, and action or practical implementation form a bit of a triad. It's great to be able to make sense of things, but then at some point we have to make decisions. And then at another point, of course, hopefully we're taking some kind of action. And I think realized in that context and in our contemporary world, we're trying to take a step back here and say, let's get rooted in our own sense making first. It's very easy to jump into action, or very easy to jump into believing we know what to do, making decisions. Um, but it's another thing to really stop and evaluate, well, how am I making sense of this? How are we making sense of this? So it's really urgent and quite important that we really start with our own context, resources, and conditions and capabilities under which we are making sense. Yeah, and all aspects of it obviously are very complex. So go ahead, Brandon.
Yeah, so, and we got this from Sensemaking 101. So sensemaking is the act of, perceiving the environment and responding to navigating to change and uncertainty, rigorous testing, seeking out diverse opposing perspectives, bringing awareness to the thinking process, continuously updating our perspectives based on new information, creating context and perspective, creating models, schemas, and maps for how our evolving systems work, making connections and building knowledge and uncovering patterns, flow, and relationships, seeing systems in their nature. So there's this constant flow, this cycle. And you can actually even see it as like kind of a flow, wheel within wheel. And then there's so much to it, but it is this at least a cyclical process that includes, these elements.
Yeah, and if you look at just how many things are on that slide, right? It's stepping back into sense making isn't necessarily stepping back into simplicity. There's a lot to this, and all the more challenge then to try and to get clear all of these elements of sense making for yourself before we even, move on to imagine what we're going to do.
Right. And I thought about how, first of all, so much of sense making involves evaluating information, and there are so many claims. You have so much information that you could not possibly personally verify, but you have to rely on it. Like, we have scientific knowledge, we have historical knowledge. It's really important. This helps drive our lives and helps maintain the sociocultural fabric that he maintains our peace in the world of such that it still exists. So we can look at claims, which we have these considerations. So I'm gonna lead each quadrant with the questions. They're like 6 W questions, at least in English. And that these can be seen to align with the different quadrants according to the work of Sean Esbjorn Hargens. And so in the upper left, we have why was the claim made? What is the experience behind the claim? What first and there are multiple considerations within each quadrant. So just to give a couple, I've give 2 examples for each. What firsthand experience served as the ultimate source of the claim? So any valid claim, any information about something that supposedly happened had to have ultimately originated in someone's firsthand observation. Even often it was more than one person, and the information given is somehow an amalgamation of multiple people's experiences. But there could be misunderstandings in the mix, even if people are being as honest as they can. So you have to ask yourself, what were those first person experiences that led to the creation of this information in the first place? Much of the misinformation that is out there is a result of misunderstandings in how people interpret their experiences, how they describe their experiences, or how they interpret the descriptions in language. There's a lot of confusion there. So there's always some experiences at the root of any claims, and so sometimes the claim is nothing close to the actual experience, and that is because for one reason or another, people often lie or make stuff up, perhaps because they intend to deceive, or perhaps because they have some unprocessed shadow material. So when you say that something is a lie, these people don't even necessarily know that they're lying. So that's something that these are considerations that have to be taken into account. Another consideration in the upper left is, does the claim seem to come from a position of honesty? So this is called truthfulness, as is in some of Wilber's work, as derived from Habermas. And so in the upper left, we can ask if the claim is coming from a position of honesty or if it is deceitful or perhaps even manipulative in nature. And keep in mind that people who spin lies are not fully consciously aware that they are doing because of cognitive dissonance or other pathologies. And I think that a lot of, like, for example, QAnon conspiracies are spun by people who are not fully mentally well. So that's got to be taken into account here. So then that brings us then to the lower left. So who made the claim and what can we know about them? One consideration is the claimant credible? So any claim has sources, and this includes people who had firsthand experiences and the media organizations through which it was propagated. And for each of these sources, whether they be individual people, groups, organizations, or institutions, their credibility is relevant. It's a relevant matter. And you are not necessarily committing the ad hominem fallacy when you take this into account. People and organizations that make claims and propagate them earn their credibility or lack thereof based on their track record, based on how frequently they have provided good information versus bad information in the past. The credibility of a claim is stronger or weaker based on the track record of any source that provided or helped propagate the claim, all factors being equal. And if we take a sober-minded look, we would probably find that many of the mainstream legacy media sources are significantly more credible than alternative media sites, many of which actually have a history of propagating debunked fringe ideas. Of course, no source is infallible, and oftentimes you do actually, it certainly does happen that alternative media sites provide information that mainstream media organizations aren't touching. But just like if you kind of looked at, did a scorecard, you might actually find that you're getting, pretty decent information from even the mainstream media organizations, many ways. Another consideration in the lower left is, does the claimant have credentials in the area in which they are speaking? So it is also helpful and is often necessary, depending on the context and the nature of the claim at hand, for the source of the claim to be trusted by their peers and to have some sort of professional credentials or membership in a professional organization that has its own credibility. For example, if a self-proclaimed epidemiologist makes a claim about viruses and vaccines, but this person lacks any sort of academic professional credentials in this field, then it's a good indication that this person, doesn't really know what they're talking about. Now, none of these criteria points, including this criteria point that I'm offering, are absolute requirements for the evaluation of information, for the credibility of information. Sometimes, for example, independent researchers, people outside the mainstream who don't have any formal training or credentials can make important discoveries that mainstream academic institutions and professional organizations fail to see. Sometimes these institutions can be inside the box. They can be resistant to new ideas and new paradigms, but we do need to take this into account when we're evaluating information. So moving on to the upper right, we have what, where, and when was the claim about? Does it make sense? Does the claim have provenance from its ultimate source, and how was it propagated? That's one important consideration, because most information that we take in has been propagated multiple times from the original claimant before it gets to us. Sometimes there are many degrees of hearsay, and this information tends to get further and further from the truth the more times it has been propagated from the original source. The original claimant who observed the events firsthand, you might be many 3-4 degrees removed from that, or not even know how many degrees. This comes into play more when we're looking at historical information and when sorting out information that came about from times of chaos and confusion. Just for example, we have the January 6th riot at the Capitol in 2001. There's a lot of claims and counterclaims about what happened there, a sea of confusion, a lot of hearsay, a lot of a lot of things, even, I mean, not everything was fully documented. Pretty difficult, but that's an important thing we need to try to figure out. Another consideration in the upper left is, I'm sorry, the upper right is the claim coherent and plausible? And so one of the most basic things about to ask ourselves is, does the claim add up with what we already know? Is the claim coherent with what has already been accepted as fact? Now, sometimes contradictory information could mean that something we already accepted as fact is actually false. So we have to weigh these claims based on their plausibility, given what we already are taking to be factual. So moving on finally to the lower right, this is about how does the claim fit? How is the claim related to its background environment, and does it seem to fit? Um, One consideration is, are the claims described naturalizable? So this is related to the question of coherence, but it is distinct because it is usually possible to figure out ways to make competing claims cohere with each other, because you could just keep complexifying the scenario to accommodate more and more information. I think QAnon does this, so that all claims can be thought to be true simultaneously. Um, and unless the claims are just, plainly directly contradictory, this is usually possible. Some conspiracy theorists do this, but the world they build becomes increasingly implausible because the whole thing just ends up being wacky and it goes against nature. So we should consider whether claims comport with the laws of nature and are thus naturalizable, or whether they're based on ad hoc reasoning and magical thinking. Now, sometimes there's a place for such thinking, and supernatural phenomena might be plausible. But it seems to make sense. It doesn't actually seem to make sense to go with claims about supernatural phenomena. In very many situations, we really need to cast doubt on claims that rely on appeals to supernatural phenomena, or just that don't seem to comport with nature as we understand it. The final consideration here in the lower right, are the events described by the claim cohesive in their context? And for this, we can evaluate the claim by considering how these events would impact the outer context in which they occurred, and how the background context would have impacted the claims in question, the events in question. Okay. Um, all of these events have to relate to each other, and there would have to be there were interrelated networks of claims describing them. Um, it is useful to try to get a sense of the larger picture and how these claims relate to each other, and what can be known about the larger phenomena, in which the more specific claims are a microcosm, and ask if there is cohesion within this sea of information, and to what extent it seems plausible. So I think at a whole, this seems to also relate to critical realism's depth stratified ontology. I figure that some of these elements here can be seen more in the empirical realm, like, for example, the firsthand experiences of the ultimate claim, um, and some of them are more in the domain of the actual, which is a little bit removed from our direct experience. Just for example, this propagation of claims and the background context. And kind of what we're getting at here is we're trying to understand the real domain. It's more elusive, but going through processes like this helps us get away from these demi realities, these fictitious worldviews that can have inherent pathologies, and we can try to develop a better understanding of the real. So Marty, I think you might have some thoughts on some of this.
So that last point, are events described by the claim cohesive in their context? Just a really simple example. I remember when I first heard that somebody had put in petition to stop polio vaccines recently. And it kind of knocked me back because I have an aunt who was a polio sufferer. And so my whole view of history, and I mean this from a sociological and a public health perspective, everything I believe I've understood about what happened with polio is that the vaccine did this. So when I hear somebody saying, let's stop the vaccine, it's like, wow, how do I start to integrate those things? And I think that, this is where maybe I'll just go ahead and transition to the next slide, because part of my view about this is that, where we go with this is we start to ask ourselves, well, where are we at in terms of our ability to make sense of things, but to look at ourselves and to look at our own biases and information. So Brandon's done a really good job of laying out a framework for a way in which we can apply a sort of methodologically pluralistic approach to this kind of four-quadrant analysis of the claim itself. What I want to do now is to say, okay, well, can I apply that same simple four-quadrant analysis to just, me here trying to make sense of this? And I think starting up in the upper left, there's this whole perspective of what am I bringing to the table already? And therefore, what am I entering the room with? What am I entering the sense making process with? Jumping quickly over to the upper right, there's this evaluation of, well, where am I at, right? Like, am I really, really triggered by this? Has my nervous system kind of spun out? Has my prefrontal cortex shut off? And I'm no place to listen and learn anymore? And also, how alone am I? I think a lot of the talk about making sense of, particularly of the media and the information system, a lot of the language, not Brandon's today, but a lot of the language points to this kind of highly individualistic, me as rational being, using all of my rational capabilities to make sense of things and going through the world as a soldier of information and understanding. I think that in and of itself is a cultural pressure. And there's a narrative in there that I'm being fed, not only the narrative of the information, but the narrative of the cultural context I'm in. And getting a sense of that and starting to realize that a lot of sense making is about working collaboratively with people that I trust. And this kind of intersubjectivity is a really, really important element to bring to the table. Because let's face it, if you go to the lower right, there's an awful lot going on that feels just like pure information propaganda, and that we're really being influenced, and it's very, very difficult to know what sources to trust. And so, that really brings me to this, very, very real consideration about, how do we establish the conditions to make ourselves strong and safe in that environment? And how do we rely on one another, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So it really brings us to this place where understanding the significance of our own development, our ability to developmentally understand what's going on with us, and our ability to connect with other people and who we are connect with and evaluate that, which brings us to Brandon's discussion, I think, on the significance of development itself.
Yeah, so there
Thanks,
there is
Brandon.
these effects of development on sense making, because a person's ability to rationally make sense of the news, information, and claims depend on their level of development. So consider that the criteria points listed in the previous two slides would often require one to be able to take on a perspective on another person's perspective, or in some cases, a higher degree of recursive nth person perspectives on perspectives. And this is not a capacity that everyone has. People do not naturally have this when they're born, especially, young people, but also a significant percent of the adult population in every country in the world, including the ones that are, supposedly, free, fair, democratic with a rule of law. A lot of people don't have this perspective. They just kind of see the world in their own through their own lens, and this very limited perspective taking skills has major ramifications on democratic institutions, on the rule of law, and our ability to hold leaders accountable for what, actions taken in office. So it's very difficult in this situation. Um, People might be baffled at the weird things that other people believe, but everyone's cognitive and emotional developmental altitude plays an important part in all of this. I mean, probably many of us have relatives or friends or neighbors who are hardcore MAGA or QAnon or followers or the like, and not to let the far left off the hook either. They've got some very, weird and, dangerous beliefs as well. Um, I can't wrap my mind around how anyone could believe some of these things. But then there's a recognition of personal fallibility. I myself probably have beliefs that would be shown to be just plainly false and irrational upon further reflection. But I wouldn't be able to say what those are specifically now because doing so would require me to develop further cognitively and emotionally in significant ways. And then I'd be able to look back on, oh gosh, wow, that was weird. Why did I believe that? So unfortunately, there are many people who passionately believe some very weird things, perhaps even dangerous things, in our world, and we need to be able to figure out ways of dealing with that.
It circles back to this, my point about individualist approaches versus, quote, collective approaches. When I say collective approaches here, I'm really pointing even something as simple as a small group of people, 44 to 7 people who are actually able to connect on a regular basis to help one another make sense, a kind of a cohort model where, we have a touchstone of people who, in a sense, already have demonstrated an ability to sort through this, that that this metacognition, um, that yes, integral folks with wacky beliefs. Um, the the metacognition, to be able to look at how we cognate, how we're actually processing things is a reality and a capability that we could develop. But it also, points to this next thing about, well, who's your cohort, which is the next point about, friends, family, cultural leaders that we're already embedded with. So having a sense, so it's the next point, Brandon, is that that environment is where we're often checking in. And of course, belonging has a lot to do with that. So we know, at least there seems to be a lot of information around that says my uh, commitment to my, if you will, mythical membership in whatever my uh, little group is, means I'm willing to go along with anything because my membership's way more important than the facts. And that's just a need. And the recognition of that need and realizing that I'm wrapped in it, but also recognizing, am I in a group of people who are going to challenge that, who are going to participate in that metacognition in a realistic way? So it becomes very, very important to take a look at these developmental questions. But the same point, which is the next point, Brandon, is that the developmental models that we're playing with are always tricky. And, it in some ways, it simply has to do with how well we're capable of actually managing all the complexity that we're faced with. And a really simple old integral backstop for me has just been that coexistence of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern perspectives in the here and now. That, in our cultural milieu, there's this representation of those views. And it's often just a really interesting ability to step back and from a perspective taking point of view is to go into those perspectives and really inhabit them and to try to come away with an understanding, because that sometimes really transforms what I believe I'm hearing from other people. To go into a really deep, concrete, operational, pre-modern kind of mode helps me understand sometimes where someone's at, that, they're latched on to a set of rules and they're going to interpret the world that way. As well, from a more modern perspective, having a kind of more maybe a strong scientific perspective only, or from a postmodern perspective, being more flexible and open and maybe becoming too flexible and open, but yet somehow being closed down and not being able to see the pre-modern and modern perspectives. So that's just a quick overview of at least a little bit of a developmental discussion. Yeah, so I think in that context, even though it's got its caveats, to even just have the discussion of how those views are showing up within any claim or with any situation or even within our little group when we're discussing something becomes very, very important.
And we
So
can look
back
at
to you, Brandon.
Yeah, we can look at these images, which I just really they're just stock images. They brought in and the colors don't have anything to do with spiral dynamics. But we can just look at the first one here, the top one. This guy's navigating upward, and then there is a certain perspective on this altitude in development. But the bottom image, this guy's trying to navigate a maze. And the idea being that we can also look at these developmental capabilities as being within us, and that we need to figure out how to coordinate them according to the context, according to the situation. We have the traditional, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, and this, integral capability allows us to, is where we can uh, utilize these capacities and coordinate them in navigating our environment, navigating the sense-making landscape, both individually and collectively. Thank you guys very much. We got our logos here for the Enlightened Worldview Project and for Local Sense News. You guys can check that out. And I think we are.
Yeah, thanks for this overview. I think it's really comprehensive. Probably somewhere in one of the quadrants, there is what I'm going to ask now. Um, would you say a little bit more about how you interpret the word claim? Uh, I can say all horses are dangerous, which is a claim, but I can also say this is my hypothesis. This is how let's put it this way, there are very, very different types of claims. Are you trying to present something that works for all claims, or is there a little more background you would want to give on
I
this?
think I think that every one of these, at least one of these considerations that I was offering, is relevant for any given claim, including the type that you're talking about. Some sort of categorical claim. Or is it self-evident? Is there some evidence behind it? Is it Now? This is really important. What I was most interested in is the claims being made within media about events, about
Okay.
events of national and global significance, about something that happened, that someone might have said, something that also, I mean, it's not just earlier today, but it's yesterday, last week, last year, 10 years ago, 100 years ago. A lot of claims that are about events that might or might not have happened 3,000 years ago are actually very relevant to our lives. So those sort of evidential claims, looking at things from that evidential standpoint. But in a lot of these cases, though, we don't really have the ability to look at the evidence directly. We have to look at the claimant and the credentials, because we don't have that capability to evaluate the claims. I mean, some people think, well, I'm doing my own research, on vaccines or whatever. And maybe there's something to that, but I just wanted to look at this landscape in a four quadrant perspective, and also looking at things. I mean, if we had a little more detail, we could look at things in terms of the depth stratified ontology of critical realism and perhaps some other frameworks that could help us understand all the points that are to consider when we're evaluating claims and what kind of claim it is. And then indeed the kind of propositions. There's ways of categorizing propositions, as you were stating there. There's frameworks given by J.L. Austin, and others, John Searle, that you could look at. And if I had a little, more time, I could perhaps, look at those categories and see, which are more relevant than others, depending on that type of claim that it would be according to those taxonomies.
Thanks. May I make two brief comments? I really like that Andrew is bringing up a sixth sense or intuition, although that's probably for another discussion. And then it struck me with the example of the vaccine. I'm not interested in if a claim is about a vaccine is true. I'm actually more interested in if the vaccine is good, if it works. So
Well, that's of course that
this is
a claim that it
fascinating.
works or that it's good. That's a claim.
Yeah, but
What's the difference between
very
truth
often the
and
word
goodness?
truth pops up is the claim true, but actually we're talking about is the claim good. And I think that difference can really help us in sense making, which is also a claim.
Yeah, and in fact, that was one of my points, is that in order to evaluate any one of these claims, you have to actually look at claims about other claims and kind of to yourself make claims about the credibility of a claimant. Not necessarily that you're propagating that, but you're kind of thinking that to yourself, and that you're relying on these claims or past claims, any one of which, am I resting? Is that much of my reasoning resting on any one of these claims? Because then, what if that one is just not true? So it is a web of, information evaluation. But with this complexity and all of the, claims relating to other claims and that difficulty of evaluating this. Some people were looking at this, some decades ago, Foucault, Derrida, and that was where, postmodernism came from. They're like, well, it's all a big mess of claims and it's all interpretation, you know? But as integralists, we need to be able to look beyond that, not and while still recognizing that any one of these claims could be fallible, but that it is that there's other factors such as the fittedness of the claims or the personal direct connection that you have to something. You're not going to gaslight yourself because sometimes, you might do that. Some people have a certain insecurity to where they're going to actually give more credence to another person's claims versus your own personal experience. So you have to have these sort of anchor points. And you can build then a certain kind of internal map to help navigate this. And so much of it also depends on people that you trust and that you collaborate with to help navigate things together. And that's how our political and economic and legal systems are built upon these networks of these institutions, these networks of trust, and I definitely get the sense that they're falling apart in our time. The rule of law is not doesn't seem to apply to everybody. Some of the most wealthy and powerful people in the world seem to be able to break laws with impunity. Our institutions seem to be fraying and crumbling, and the rule and there doesn't really seem to be meaningful accountability for some of the political leaders for tyrannical actions committed while in office. And I think so much of this is comes not just down to development, but also having these frameworks for being able to navigate the ever increasingly complex media landscape, wherein I think a lot of people just they have a certain media outlet that they just trust, and some others who are cynical because there's so much, you know, disinformation, misinformation out there, and it's impossible to navigate it. So why even bother? So I want to say that there's a way through that. There are processes for navigating this, and we can do that. Marty, do you have
Brandon,
thoughts?
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think Namali pointed something out in the chat that, you know, personality and health both come in here as well, right? Is that not just of others or of groups, but also of ourselves. That so there's a lot of complexity here that also relies on really difficult stuff like that, right? And one thing I am curious after hearing what you got to say there, Andrew, I'm just curious whether there's other folks who'd like to jump in, if got any questions or concerns, so that we, broaden out the discussion and recognize the collective reality that's here on this weird thing called Zoom. And but what were you going to say, Andrew?
I love what everyone shared, like Mikhail and you both, and I just muse on the it's amusing, at least to me, the paradox of the whole situation, because you're right. Like, take the vaccine scenario; it's so complex, and the reality of it is, as an individual human being, we don't have all of the information to hand. We never will. We'll always have a partial truth here. But what's always 100% true is you are the person making the decision to inject it into your arm. And that is where the personal responsibility lies, no matter which quadrant or all quadrants you're addressing. Yeah. And so, I feel like the paradox of complexity is that it's actually really, really simple. Ultimately, Carl Jung said it, we are the authors of our lives. If we choose to pick an external authority and place our trust in them and place our relational attention in them, then that's our choice. If we choose to be an internal authority who's hyper skeptic and doesn't trust the government and believes there's UFOs and lizard men and women that are going to come down and invade the earth, ultimately that's our responsibility. And so, what's incredibly complex is also incredibly simple. And
I do want to speak to that because I think much of what we're talking about here is beyond personal responsibility. Even if I concede the point that you just made about vaccines, there's so much of like, okay, what do we do with the commons, with our land? How do we steward this? How do we protect our environment? How do we have appropriate ways of distributing funds? And how do we educate ourselves? And how do we provide for our defense? It is not just an individual responsibility. We cannot just rely on that. Now, for this particular example that you gave, perhaps. So this is why collective sense making and trying to understand truth as best we can through these processes is super important. And we can't just, rely on saying, well, it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to do, what works for me. And, that works for certain probably does seem to work for certain questions, certain matters. Perhaps the one that you offered there, but there are so many other matters that in the political sphere, in our economic lives, in our socio-cultural fabric, that are just so much, a collective sense-making process, and we can't just have a and rely on this personal responsibility and just end it there.
Yeah, I think I saw Andre's hand go up, and I think Domali was next.
Yeah, well, it's coming out already. Yeah, we're starting to refer to a distinction that I was becoming aware of, and that is the sense making for myself, developing the ability to shortcut my decision making with certain rules, which I already have, but I need to improve given the new media or the new state of the information that I'm receiving. And then there's a totally different dimension in which this is a completely different game, and that is where we have a really big problem when we talk about the collective and sense making in the collective. So I may be, I will adopt or adapt myself with my education, such as in this setting. And that may or may not probably very faintly influence the community, which is being misled and et cetera, et cetera. But that's a wicked problem. I think that is really serious challenge. We can work on ourselves, and eventually, I suppose it's going to propagate through the environment. But is it going to be fast enough? That's where, so yeah, the distinction that I see coming up now is what I thought was important, which is sense making as an individual and sense making as a collective. Very different dimensions, very different problems, very different challenges.
Namala, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think Andrew dropped off, but I think I was just having a little bit of a response or a question to him also. I understand what he was saying about how it sort of is ultimately an individual decision. I think it's only partially true. That's a partially true claim. All claims are partially true. I think we also already know that everything is only partially true. My, where I think we cannot take full responsibility is that, you know, how John Vervaeke talks about bullshitting ourselves, that there is actually there's a paper, there's an actual academic paper written by Frank somebody, called On Bullshit. And if you read that, it's not the easiest paper to read, but it still tries to make
Harry
sense.
Frankfurt.
Harry Frankfurt, that's right. So there is an apparatus that we all have called the brain, that sometimes is one of the big things we use to make sense of our experience, can trick us. So we don't have a choice sometimes. And sometimes, you know, Andrew was also saying, you know, to take the vaccine, ultimately it comes down to your own individual decision. Well, there are some people who can't make that decision. They're maybe too old or too sick or mentally not able to make that decision, and yet to protect themselves or protect others around them, sometimes they're given that. It's administered to them. There's a horrible, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of the horrible French case that's going on with the woman Giselle Pellico, where she was raped by over 70 women over a period of a decade. While she was asleep, she was drugged and unable to make a responsible decision for herself, and she was severely abused in that sense. So I think sense making is, there are features and the gestalt of an entire situation that is tetra arising that makes it such a complicated issue to make sense of what's going on. And I don't think it's just the individual decision. That's all I wanted to say.
Phyllis.
Thank you. I think that one of the things that's so important about the collective, as opposed to you know, every decision being an individual move, is that when there are two, there's an in-between. there's a place where the novel happens. And that's why in Relations 1 and 1 isn't 2. 1 and 1 is question mark, because there are novel things that arise between a dyad or a triad or a larger group or a large group or a large group. It just gets logarithmically more. And that's the one thing that I haven't heard in your presentation, where I think you really are talking about how important it is, how important collective decision making is. That there's that novelty in it that is hard to actually account for, but that's so important in terms of moving things forward.
Yeah. Sorry,
Marilyn, do
Marty.
you want to jump in? Marilyn?
There it is. Okay, I'm kind of new to this, so bear with me. When I heard sense making was going to be talked about today, I had an idea in my mind about answering some of my questions concerning sense making of this election. So I watch a lot of interviews on both sides. And I recently, I think I put this in the chat, I watched 2 interviews by one of my favorite interviewers, which is Barry Weiss, one with Peter Thiel and one with Mark, I think it's Andreessen. They're 2 billionaires, tech billionaires. And I actually spoke to Nomali about this because she saw it as well. After listening to the first one, Peter Thiel, I thought, wow, that's a very convincing claim about prehistory and what happened and why it happened. I could see where people would watch that and go, wow, that's like, that makes sense. Now I understand Trump's the right guy, you know? And then Anderson, who is a longtime left of center, left person, gave an incredible interview. And by the end of it, at first I thought, I don't know if I can take much more of this, but then I stayed with it. And he said, you know, things kind of went downhill, second term Obama and then Biden. But before that, Clinton and the various other liberal representatives and people were doing the right thing. But then he jumped ship and went with Trump. And then, okay, so here's claims. They're making claims. Now I'm going to take this to integral higher levels of perspective. I'm trying to be more understanding and listen to other perspectives so that I can be open, more open to what the conversation is, the vibe shift or whatever is going on. And then I thought, well, what happened in Germany with what happened with the World War II? What did people just keep one perspective, or did they ever take the perspective of Hitler and think, he's actually pretty good for us? You know? And so now I'm in a state of confusion. And I want to hear back from anybody that can help me with an understanding from a grander, higher altitude perspective of what's happening in our country. I don't mean to go back to World War II, but it brought up the question of holding, whether it's vaccines or whether it's things that the MAGA is doing, and things that we didn't do as liberals, and all that together, taking a perspective that is open and giving some clarity to understand historically where we are in all this. So I'll just I'm getting myself in a tizzy here about it, but anybody that can, Karen, help me.
Does someone want to respond to that? I've got a comment, but does anyone else want to jump in?
I'd love to hear from you, Marty, your comment to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to go all meta on this, but fundamentally, for me, the evaluation of all these things come down to some really basic things. I have a direct experience in my life that I kind of feel like I'm part of a fabric that's a fabric of life that's just, remarkably compassionate and generous. Like I feel like life is like that, that the nature, this fabric we live in is compassionate and generous. And so a lot of ultimately my claim evaluation comes down to trying to be around other people who can feel into something like that too. And then look at what's happening and ask ourselves, what kind of congruence, what kind of alignment is there with that underlying generativity, that generousness, that compassion that we kind of knows here? Now, it wouldn't have taken me very long in the late 30s to listen to Adolf Hitler and go, that's not feeling compassionate, it's not resonating with me, right? So at that level, I'm just saying, for me, there's a ground level, there's a ground of being, there's a ground of awareness that I believe developmentally is important to come back to in the evaluation of claims. And my own view on that is that that's best accessed with other people. It's very hard to do that all by myself. But when I'm in a group of people, even a small group of people, we can access that together.
I'd like to make a couple comments. My parents lived through the war under occupation. I think that a lot of Germans were genuinely excited and on board. And I also talked, well, rather corresponded with a Trump voter um, who explained that she and others were also optimistic, positive, and excited. They hear a positive message. So I would not underestimate how in the 30s you, Marty, also have been influenced. And for the same token, I could say the same thing about me. Germany was highly traumatized after the First World War, and the communication wizard Hitler brought hope and pride and something to stand for. And of course, Trump is doing the same. And people believe it. It's not just like angry gun wielding people. It's lots of people that are literally excited and on a high and believe things are going to get better. And we have to accept that and deal with it instead of throw it out.
Thank you, Karen. I'm going to say it again. You know, I'll get myself in a lot of trouble taking a somewhat absolutist position. But this sort of ground of being that I'm pointing to, that there's something called wisdom, there's something called love, there's something called insight, there's something called compassion, and they're real. And it's very difficult to have discussion of claims or discussion of what's good for our country or discussion about what Trump is or is not or what the MAGA movement represents when it isn't referenced back, if you will, to the good, the true, and the beautiful, or whatever overarching framework of wisdom and love and compassion you want to feel into. I do think there's a fundamental worldview question here. I do think that it's often really useful to start with those kind of fundamental discussions. And it can be very difficult to have the conversation, but sometimes if I'm facing somebody in my own family who's got a strong, let's say, Fox News influenced position, I often end conversations by asking the question, I'm just trying to understand where the wisdom and the compassion and the love is in this. Can we talk about that? And very often the answer is effectively no, but at least I'm just saying it's worth asking the question. I'd love if we were able to ask that question all the time, right? Like, it's almost like there's a social negation of that. There's such an allergy to having that fundamental. We can disagree about what's love and compassion and wisdom, but maybe we could start by talking about what's love and wisdom and compassion in this instance. What's it look like for us?
And I wanted to go back to
Red doesn't give a shit about compassion.
Well, then that'll be very exposing, won't it?
no, I wanted to go back to something that Phyllis was, I think, pointing out something that maybe some sort of a lack or absence in our presentation. And if you wanted, Phyllis, you can get a little more detailed into that. That maybe there's something that we didn't cover adequately.
Well, actually, Brandon, as after I said it, I was thinking, well, it's really not exactly what you're speaking about, because what you're speaking about, I think, is how the collective is making sense, has a better chance of making sense together than we do individually. So you're talking about the underpinnings of sense making, and I was really talking about sort of something a little bit different. So I don't think that it's a lack in your presentation. I think that I was just talking about another reason that collective is so imperative when you're talking about either making sense or about creating sense.
And so one thing that Marty and I were talking about, we didn't know, okay, so we were figuring we want to do this presentation. We have this kind of like extending the framework, the Aqua model into claim and information analysis, which is not something I really found anywhere, which is why we put it together. But then we also wanted to use it. We wanted to go through some major issues of public concern, within the U.S. or Europe or globally, and put it to the test. Now, I think we're just about out of time, or in the 90 minutes we had allotted for this. But then there's a possibility we might do a follow-up and actually do that and actually put something on the table and go through some of these considerations and say, how credible is this claim or this line of reasoning? How do we assess this? So that's one thing we could perhaps do. Yes, Namali.
I was gonna say, yeah, I mean, I think that it'll be great if Marty, you and Brandon could bring like a real world scenario, and then we go through some of the frameworks that are sort of intervally informed to address that and talk about it. That would be helpful. I was just going to briefly mention that when it comes to sense making, Wilbur has talked about the 3 strands of verification, or the 3 strands of knowledge, like injunction, or taking up a praxis and then actually experiencing that. And then the 3rd strand is to verify it with the community of the adequate. So that's one thing to remember. The community of the adequate is now, I think, more complex. It's not just so easy as to figure out, well, what is the community of the adequate, I think. And then along with that, I think it's also interesting to think about how we make sense about what. And I think we need, and here also I'm reminded of Wilbur's teachings of the eye of mind, the eye of flesh. He calls it the 3 eyes of knowing, a little different to Viveki's 4 P's of knowing. But the 3 eyes of knowing, as per Wilbur, is the eye of flesh, the eye of mind, and the eye of spirit. So you need these 3 different tools of knowing, of epistemology, to figure out different things, different kinds of wisdom about these. There are different domains of the what that we're trying to make sense of. So.
And indeed, I think that we need all 4 P's of knowing. And as you mentioned, there's some overlap there. They kind of seem to, have some common ground between those frameworks, but that The four P's of knowing of Vervaeke, I think actually in some ways it goes into a certain territory that Wilbur doesn't cover it that directly, that or he doesn't foreground it as much, so that's participatory, procedural, perspectival, and propositional knowing. And much of what we're doing here today is to analyze the propositional knowing. That's the symbolic communication. It's in some sort of claim, in or some sort of proposition we have somewhere. And then ultimately, at the ground of being is more actually participatory. So that's interesting because we often think of our conscious experience, as being that grounded being, and it is, of course, but that's perspectival knowing, and that there's actually the reason that participatory knowing is really important is because this is how your gestalt is calibrated. So what you might actually notice, what might be salient to you in your conscious experience, that's your perspectives, might actually filter out certain important things that through practice, through fittedness with your environment, and through opening up through to a resonance with the environment, which is participatory knowing. That's where that can come into play as well. And then there's also, there's procedural knowing, so that's different kinds of procedures, and this can include ecologies of practice. Any one of those practices can have a procedure behind it, but then the ecology itself is not really something that can be broken down to a procedure, so therefore it's much more participatory. And that probably aligns somehow with Wilbur's eyes of flesh, mind, and spirit. I don't know how that would coincide. Perhaps there's a pretty straightforward way in which those are correlated. But anyway, so I think we might be just about out of time. Does anybody have any additional comments or questions? Yes, Arthur.
Yeah, doing the work of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, and showing up, and developing these different lines of intelligences helps you perceive truth better.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And so I suppose there's a possibility we might do more sessions like this, in 2025. And well, you guys can be on the lookout for that on the Integral Life calendar. Do you have any closing thoughts, Marty?
Yeah, I'd like to encourage that. I thought Namali's brought up, I think, some really good follow-on to the sort of basic quadrant to altitude kind of discussion today. And that might be really well delving into as well as bringing in Vervaeke's 4Ps and looking at other frameworks. The one thing I personally wouldn't want to lose, one of the things I like about your your quadrant analysis and same thing with the self-analysis, is that there's these really pragmatic questions we can ask ourselves. And it comes down to praxis. So one of the things I'd want to, if we were going to do another session, I think having some actual praxis of breaking something down using a framework, and even doing that potentially collectively, might be really interesting and helpful for people. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys very much. And yeah, we'll probably something like this on the calendar for maybe January. But I do thank everybody for coming. And if anybody wants to send me questions via email, I'm Brandon@enlightenedworldview.com. And Marty, I'm not sure if you want to give your yeah, I think you're at localsensenews.com. You also have a Substack.
I do have a Substack as well. You can find me on Substack.